Live and direct, live and a date no jive.
Legalize it.
So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
I'm back with Steve DeAngelo, and it's another episode of the Koala podcast special, Steve DeAngelo live story. And when we last spoke, Steve and I, which was a few months ago now, we were at the end of the Carter administration, and we obviously followed, but we were sort of walking towards the brave new world of Reagan and the war on drugs. Steve, what happened in your personal life as we made that change politically? The states moved to the right somewhat at that time, not like it is today, but there was a big shift, and drugs, his ongoing dislike, nay hatred of drugs since the 60s really came to the fore, didn't it?
It was this really dramatic change in Washington, D.C., my hometown, when we went from Carter to Reagan. And, in Carter, the cultural ethos was that we had an energy crisis. The energy crisis had really hit for the first time in a serious way during Carter's administration. And Carter responded by turning the thermostat down on the White House heating system, installing solar panels, which had just come out on the roof of the White House, and wearing a sweater, and urging Americans to wear sweaters and turn down their thermostats. And so it's this very humble, folksy kind of approach. Well, Reagan came in, and that folksy, homey kind of approach was replaced by limousines and fur coats and diamonds and ostentatious wealth. And Reagan kicked it off, much as Trump has recently, with these very ostentatious balls and very lots of donations to the inaugural campaign by donors. And so, that it set the mood in Washington, D.C. And then that was quickly, that moment, that all gave us yippies a moment of foreboding. And then that was followed up by Nancy Reagan embracing this campaign against drugs as her pet project. At this time, one of the things that influenced Nancy Reagan and formed the core of her Just Say No coalition was something called the Parents Movement. And the Parents Movement was started by a woman named Julia Nakpodia, and she became active in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. And the Parents Movement was a movement to close down head shops because at that point, had head shops all across the United States who were selling rolling papers and paraphernalia, what we would call smoke shops today. And so she headed this very hysterical campaign claiming that the head shops were trying to lure children into lifetimes of drug addiction by selling them cannabis-based toys. And she pointed to all these playful kinds of things that were just things that weren't aimed at children. They were just playful because cannabis people were playful. And so she had all of these different things that she would have this dog and pony show. And Nancy Reagan heard about the Parents Movement, and she incorporated Julia Nakpodia and the Parents Movement into her Just Say No. And then Ronald Reagan saw the utility in rolling back the Reagan approach to cannabis, which was, Reagan saw the political utility in rolling back the Carter approach to cannabis. and really embraced his wife's campaign and started bringing a lot of funding behind it. And so you also saw this typical Republican strategy of bringing corporations into the mix and getting corporations to fund organizations like the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. And so all of this private and public money was brought to bear. And one of the first things that happened was this huge propaganda campaign to convince to really change the conversation that had been trending towards cannabis legalization. And the most notorious of these of this media campaign was the frying egg commercial. Right? You remember that one?
I do remember that. I mean, we didn't see it, but I remember reading about it in the press in the UK at the time. I mean, obviously it was a different world, slightly different world than we live in today. But you got your news pretty quickly, and being young, of course, because I would have been late teens by that stage. You were pretty, or mid to late teens. You were pretty aware of Reagan, his views towards things, and that culture that you just described in the White House. And I do remember the frying egg ad, because it's something we'd laugh at, of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with it, this was a television commercial that was run incessantly. And it would open up with a view of a skillet. An egg was broken on the skillet, and you saw the egg bubbling away in the skillet. And an ominous voice would come on and say, "This is your brain." And they show you the egg, and then they would crack the egg and put it in the skillet and would start bubbling when they go, "This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?" And that was the whole commercial.
I'm pretty sure I remember the Dead Kennedys using that in something on one of their albums as well. So that's probably where we heard it as well, because obviously Jello would pick up on anything Reagan did and make sure that he ridiculed it as much as possible. And that that's sort of where we got our counterculture news from, was those Californian punk bands.
Well, look, music's always been a vehicle for truth in our culture, and a way to cut through the what used to be the information blockade. But this was just one part of a multifaceted campaign that they unleashed. Now, as they are unleashing this campaign, and just to underline the message here, the point of the campaign as regards cannabis was to say that cannabis is just like all other drugs.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you. They put it on a level footing with everything else, didn't they?
That was their whole idea, right? And all the science-based education that we'd been putting out about cannabis during the 70s, they had to answer that, and their answer to that was it's all drugs. And by that time, so then what happened simultaneously with them being having this very moralistic campaign about drugs is that Ronald Reagan appointed George H.W. Bush, previously the director of the CIA, to be the director of the South Florida Drug Task Force. And this was a task force that was set up to interdict the flow of smuggled, quote unquote, drugs into South Florida. Now, at that time, the vast majority of those quote unquote drugs was cannabis that was being smuggled in from Jamaica and Colombia, which were the major producers at that time. And a lot of cannabis was coming in from those countries, most of it in great big freighters, where Colombians would send up freighters with 30 or 40 tons of weed in them. And those freighters would park themselves just outside the U.S. borders in international waters, so at around the 13 miles offshore line. And then a small army of cannabis smugglers from the U.S. would go out to those freighters and pick up, 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds, and zip it into shore.
Mhm.
And then that weed would be picked up and in places like Miami, and it would be transported to the rest of the country. And that was how most of the cannabis in the United States was being supplied at that time, as well as some weed that was still coming across the Mexican border. And so Bush is appointed the director of the task force, and he immediately sets about closing down this trade of, very excellent and very inexpensive cannabis that's coming in from Colombia and from Jamaica, and then simultaneously he mobilizes his old friends, the Cubans, who had been part of the Bay of Pigs, many of whom were still down there in Miami, just waiting for a chance to go take another run at Cuba. He gave the green light. The CIA gave the green light to those guys to start bringing in coke. And the coke came in much smaller boats, in these little cigarette boats. And so the cigarette boats full of coke came in unmolested, but the cannabis boats were closed down. So this starts unleashing the cocaine epidemic of the 1980s on the country. Simultaneously, cocaine's coming up also with CIA complicity through the West Coast, through the hands of the Contras in Nicaragua. So the CIA is bringing cocaine into the country. And then what happens is they mobilized very cleverly. They mobilized this unholy alliance of the CIA and cocaine smugglers and right-wing fascist movements throughout Latin America. They mobilized the existing weed dealer network in the United States to become cocaine dealers. And they mobilized the existing gang networks in black ghettos to start selling cocaine there. And the way it looked for me is, in those days, I was going down to Miami and I was picking up bales of Colombian weed and transporting them up north to my market in Washington, D.C. and New York. And weed started getting harder and harder and harder to find. And the price kept going up and up and up. And then finally, it got to the point where it's like, well, Steve, we do have some weed available, but the only way that they're willing to let it go is if you take some coke too.
Of course.
So for every bale of weed you get, you need to take a quarter pound of coke. And so, you said no to that a certain number of times, right? But at some point you were faced with you being entirely put out of business unless you said yes. And so a number of people, including myself, said yes, right? And were thereby converted into coke dealers. Now that period didn't last very long for me because I saw the damage coming from it pretty quickly. But for my generation, it just the entire coast to coast weed dealing network that got weed into middle class buyers all across the country got mobilized to do cocaine. And then the same thing happened in the ghettos. And this was all the result of a CIA design. It's the same CIA, which of course had been, in bringing heroin in from Southeast Asia, well documented in Alfred McCoy's books. So it was just a very dark time. On the one hand, you saw this moralistic campaign to roll back all of the work that we'd accomplished in the 70s. You saw states that had decriminalized during the 1970s, recriminalizing during the 1980s. You had this cocaine epidemic that was just devastating our communities, black and white. And, I can't tell you how many hippie stories I run into people to this day And they tell me stories of this period of time, and they're like, Steve, in the late 60s, early 70s, we had this weed thing together, or we were getting weed that was being smuggled in from Mexico or Colombia or Jamaica. We were selling that weed in our communities. We were using the money to set up recording studios and food co-ops and fund weed legalization campaigns. And all of these really beneficial things were happening. And then Coke came. And then Coke came. And none of us even need to finish telling the story at that point, because the same pattern of addiction and robbery and murder and death and imprisonment and snitching and evilness permeated all of our communities.
Yeah, well, I mean, that culture has now, once the US market was saturated, they've worked out that they can do that throughout the rest of the planet. And we're now into, I report daily. I've started writing a cocaine column just to keep myself up to date with what's going on. And there isn't a country on the planet that's untouched now by this way of doing business with cocaine. You bring it in, you sell it at the top end of the market, and you just keep dropping the price until that market is completely saturated, and everything that comes along with that. And at the same time, those in power visit death and destruction upon the same people that death and destruction is already being visited upon. So it's a terrible, terrible thing. But nobody's actually taking very seriously trying how to solve it at all.
Well, look, I was there. I saw it. And I can tell you that the cocaine epidemic unleashed on the world was handmaided by the CIA, largely for the purpose of crushing the cannabis liberation movement. And had they not done that, had they allowed us to continue moving good, inexpensive, high-quality cannabis across the country and eventually across the world, if they'd embraced the legalization of cannabis instead of fighting it, just imagine how different the world would look today.
No, entirely different. I mean, I remember visiting the States for the first time in that period, and a bit, even as just a youngster traveling around and staying with people were just offering you cocaine the whole time. And I think that was the first and the last time I tried it. I found it just never suited me. So it's something I've avoided assiduously ever since. Is that what drove you from the East Coast to the West Coast?
No, that's what drove me. Well, so as if all of that was not bad enough, Sean, added to that was basically the dissolving of the anti-war movement, the cannabis reform movement. Normal basically almost stopped existing at that time. The yippies disintegrated into a variety of different factions, none of which ever really accomplished anything on their own ever again. And so what I did is this is when I went back to get my university degree. So I went to the University of Maryland. I spent 2.5 years there to get a 4-year degree. I graduated summa cum laude. And then I did a year, and I say did as in like did a sentence, a year at George Washington School of Law.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Right.
I've avoided that.
Probably relate.
No, I've avoided that. People say, "Oh, you should go and do that." No, I'm not doing that to myself.
Yeah. So I fortunately realized a year into it that I didn't have the temperament to be an attorney, and that I was not suited to incremental pace of change. And so, but a good chunk of of that period of time, I just retreated into academia. There was no possibility of forward political movement. The movement was basically dead. You had people like Jerry Rubin, who used to be a yippie, embracing the human potential movement. there were no real options for forward motion. And so I focused on a little bit of self-care and development, and I got that education piece done in that period of time. So it was a dark and scary period for me. I was continuing to sell weed. A lot of my connections that I developed out of the yippies kind of frayed during this period of factionalism. And so it was towards the middle to the end of that period of time that, because my New York connections were no longer really working that well, I started striking out and going down to Mexico and going down to the Mexican border and started bringing weed back from that part of the world.
Okay, well, look, we're almost out of time already. So let's wait until the next episode where we come back into the light, and I presume some time to think made you start thinking about cannabis and how you could present it as a medical product, and the birth of Harborside. Yes.
No, there's still a little bit more.
There's more in between.
There's
more in between. Right? Okay.
Yeah, we came out of the 80s and into the 90s with a ray of hope, and that in the shape of Bill Clinton, which rapidly we got disabused of that notion. But then the birth of the hemp industry, and that was very, very important.
Okay, well, let's talk about that in the next episode, because actually that's a subject close to my heart, because it's not discussed enough by anybody, and in this day and age, and it really needs to be discussed as much as possible. The more hemp, the better, I say. Steve, thanks a lot once again for being on the Karma Koala podcast.
Most welcome, Sean.
Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it. Coming how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."